I want to welcome everybody to the Learn at Work webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Karen Jacobs. I'm the founding editor of the journal, and I'll be moderating today's Learn at Work webinar. We're delighted that you're here, and I know you're going to find this presentation by Tom Albin very interesting. Tom, could you advance the slide? So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tom, who's going to discuss computer ergonomics, the state of the art. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for being here.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to be speaking today about computer ergonomics, the state of the art. This is really focused on a special issue of Work that came out just a little less than a year ago. It was Work Volume 52, Number 2, and these pages as you see here. There were 10 articles that reviewed topics from lighting, computer vision syndrome, input devices, mobile computing, and a few other topics. Today I'm going to focus on 3 different articles within that special issue. They are an article on mobile device use by Meg Honan, an article on sit, stand, and sedentary work by Karol and Roberston, and an article on contact pressure written by Jay Kim and several other co-authors. So the first topic is mobile devices, and certainly there's been an amazing growth in mobile computing devices. Here's some data from a U.S. Census Bureau report. In 2010, the year the iPad was introduced, 81% of households had desktops or laptops, and 21% had handheld devices. Only 3 years later, 79% of households had desktops or laptops, so not a lot of change there. But 64% of households now had handheld devices. That's a growth of about 40% per year. All right, so naturally you might expect there could be some issues as we move into this new type of technology. And Meg Honan did an interesting article where she looked at how mobile devices are actually changing the work environment. She looked at 350 knowledge workers. She wanted to know how long people use the mobile devices per day, where do they use the mobile devices, and what kind of tasks are they used for. So here's some information about how devices are being used. Smartphones are being used about 2.3 hours per day, at least according to her survey group. Tablets are being used just a little less than an hour a day. A laptop that's an undocked laptop is being used about 1.8 hours per day, and desktops are being used about 4.5 hours per day. So desktop also includes docked laptops. So we're using our devices, or at least these individuals who were surveyed are using their devices about 9.5 hours per day. So these are the most common locations, that is the top 3, where mobile devices are used. So for smartphones, it's pretty much everywhere, and we see this every day. You know, I go for a walk at the park every day, and I think half the people I see are walking through the park on their smartphone. Undocked laptops, where are they most commonly used? Conference rooms, non-office seating, and then some people actually use them in their individual workplace. Tablets, again, non-office seating, so that could be sitting in a coffee shop, sitting on the couch at home. They're used in bed, and then in vehicles, conference rooms, or their individual workplace. So I'll show you just a little bit more detail on each one of those. Here's the chart that talks about where we use smartphones. So you can see some of those categories there. I've already given you the top 3. Here are where undocked laptops are being used. Again, everywhere from vehicles to individual workplaces to people do use them in bed as well. And where are tablets being used? So again, by far and away, the 2 primary locations for tablets are a couch or non-office chair and in bed. The top 3 uses from mobile devices, email or calendar, web browsing, and social media. So here's how smartphones are being used. See just various types of things to look up documents or data, but primarily for things like email or calendar work, internet browsing, or social media are the big items. Where are undocked laptops used? A really large number there for internet browsing. So I think a lot of that is looking at documents and similar kinds of things on undocked laptops. Here's how tablets are being used. Quite a lot of different usage, but you've already seen the top 3 for that. So here are some observations about these devices, both the mobile and desktop units. Desktops and portable devices are both being used about 4 hours per day. Epidemiologic studies suggest that more than 4 hours per day or more than 20 hours per week computer use is a threshold for a higher incidence of musculoskeletal disorders. So even though we have this major shift towards mobile work, we still have a significant amount of work that's performed on desktops. So we can't disregard those and focus only on mobile devices. If we look at mobile devices, I don't think that we really have a very clear understanding of how to deal with some of the issues related to mobile devices. So some of those issues are things like neck flexion while viewing tablets. There's at least a couple of articles in Work that talk about this. Justin Young and co-authors did a study. Hugh McLuhan and I did a study a couple of years later that both looked at neck flexion increases while viewing tablets. Probably all heard about, I think it used to be called Nintendo thumb, but we do see increased thumb pain for people using handhelds. This was a study done in Canada a few years ago. Barolo et al. And finally, how do we support people's arms when they're using mobile devices? Sigrid van Veen has done a study looking at the need for arm support and found that people reported much higher levels of comfort if they were able to sit with their arms supported while they were using mobile devices. Okay. So let's move on to our second topic, sit, stand, and sedentary work. So here's a quote from some authors that says, people spend too many hours in a waking day sitting for the scientific community to neglect the existing yet limited evidence that these behaviors may matter for metabolic diseases. So what do we mean by sedentary activity? It's defined as an metabolic energy expenditure less than 1.5 METs. A MET is defined as 1 kilocalorie per kilogram mass per hour. So please keep in mind that a kilocalorie is the calorie that we're probably all familiar with and accustomed to thinking about as calories. When someone says that, a candy bar has 350 calories in it, technically it's really 350 kilocalories. So an example, sedentary work for a 50 kilogram individual is something less than 75 kilocalories per hour. So there are a couple of questions about sedentary work and sit-stand work. And one of those is, I guess the two things that seem to be showing up are that there may be a metabolic issue separate from biomechanical issues. So here's some studies. This is Levine and Miller. This is the Mayo Clinic study. They found that standing did increase metabolic rate, but only about 13 calories per hour for a 50 kilogram person. But they found that walking at a rate of 1 mile per hour increased that metabolic rate to 4.8 kilocalories per kilogram body mass per hour. Then they went on to suggest that standing and walking 2 to 3 hours per day for 1 year might result in a 20 to 30 kilogram weight loss. So I think that has been the impetus for some of the treadmill workstations and bicycle workstations that we've seen. And of course, there are concerns about the ability to type, mouse, etc., while one is walking or cycling. All right, so let's talk about Karol and Michelle Robertson's review of sit-stand work. Based on the current literature, they concluded that treadmills, sit-stand, and bicycle workstations may be effective in reducing sedentary behavior. That is, there does seem to be support that they increase the rate of metabolic energy expenditure. However, they also conclude that there's no generally agreed ratio for standing and sitting time. So there are no scientifically based recommendations to say stand this many minutes per hour and sit this many minutes per hour. They also concluded there is some evidence that sit-stand work may increase upper extremity discomfort. They noted that the effect of sit-stand workstations on productivity appears to be beneficial, but that the effect on productivity of walking and bicycle workstations are less clear. And finally, a very strong conclusion that just providing sit-stand workstations to people isn't sufficient for them to make a successful adaptation, that you actually need to train people and rehearse them in how to use the sit-stand workstations in order for those to be effective. I don't think that Soet and Karol mentioned it, but I would suspect that something similar would be necessary if you were to use a walking or bicycling type workstation. So if standing is good, how do we get people to stand? So as I just said, Karol and Robertson concluded that training was important, that you should train people not only in how to use the workstation, but that it should include a basic knowledge of ergonomics and how that might affect people, as they said, in a workstation. And they found that the most important thing were practice periods where individuals could actually practice using the sit-stand workstations. Okay, I'd like to move on to contact pressure. So one of the things we talked about a few minutes ago was the idea of providing support for people using mobile devices. And we've certainly had long conversations about the benefits of providing support to people while they're using desktop stations as well. So we're going to talk about a study that was done by Jay Kim and several co-authors. And their study specifically looked at the effect of two different surfaces, a hard surface and a soft edge surface, on various dependent measures such as EMG and wrist posture. So the interesting thing about support is that support to the upper extremity is beneficial with regard to comfort and the lower risk of musculoskeletal disorders. But by providing support, it necessarily means that there is contact pressure. And we have always had some concerns about contact pressure within the ergonomics community. So we're going to look at a little bit of guidance from the data that Jay Kim and his group put together. So what do we know about contact pressure? Well, this is a review of some of the literature. If we apply pressure in the tissue directly under the point of contact, is approximately equal to the surface pressure. So if you take your fingertip and press on your wrist over the carpal tunnel, and you're able to produce enough pressure so that the pressure at the surface of the skin is 30 millimeters of mercury, you can expect that the tissue pressure directly under your fingertip is also about 30 millimeters of mercury. We know that in the ulnar nerve at the elbow, there was a study that was done by Prelap and various other authors in which they looked at applying pressure to the ulnar nerve, and they found that half of the research subjects reported paresthesia after about 40 minutes exposure, and that was exposure to pressures averaging about 80 millimeters mercury applied directly over the nerve. Now, if we look at that same type of thing in the wrist at the median nerve over the carpal tunnel, or pressure over the carpal tunnel, effects are seen at exposures of about 2 hours, pressures of 30 millimeters mercury or greater. So there seems to be some difference where on the body that we're applying the pressure as to how much contact pressure is going to be problematic. And then the final thing to think about with regard to this slide is that as contact pressure is applied, if it varies, if it's high and then low and then high again, the effect of that varying contact pressure is similar to application of constant pressure equal to the average of the varying pressure. So if for 1 minute pressure was 30 millimeters of mercury and then for the next minute it was 10 millimeters of mercury, the overall effect would be equivalent to the average, which would be 20 millimeters of mercury. Okay, well, this is what I think is very interesting about Jay Kim's article, in that when they looked at pressure for various kinds of tasks, whether that was keyboard work or mouse work, whether it was text editing or web browsing, as you see here, the pressures were intermittent and the average pressures were quite low. Now, they report their pressure in Newton per centimeter squared, so it's a little difficult to convert that to millimeters of mercury, which is what we're probably most familiar to looking at in regard to tissue pressures. But I've put a line on the graph here that shows where 30 millimeters mercury pressure would be. So as you can see, all of the activity, the average pressure is well below that 30 millimeter mercury threshold. So why do I talk about the 30 millimeter mercury threshold? Well, if you go and read some of the research by Keysor, Rumrill, and that group, they come out with guidelines for wrist posture based on the internal carpal tunnel pressure. And they recommend using a pressure limit either of 25 or 30 millimeters mercury as the do not exceed kind of limit, or the danger limit. So I've marked this one for 30 millimeters mercury. If you wanted to look at 25 millimeters mercury, it would be just a little bit below that, between the 0.3 and the 0.4 on the left-hand vertical axis. Okay, so here are Jay Kim's conclusions. Soft surfaces are associated with lower contact pressure, and soft surfaces are associated with less perception of fatigue, but there were no significant differences between hard and soft surfaces with regard to muscle activity, wrist posture, productivity, and subjective comfort. So that doesn't mean that there weren't beneficial effects of support with regard to muscle activity, wrist posture, productivity, etc. It just means that there was no significant difference between the hard surface and the soft surface. So this is my additional conclusion to Jay Kim's paper, and that would be to observe that contact pressure varies constantly. Well, that is contact pressure between the upper extremity and the support surface while people are keying or mousing. That contact pressure varies constantly, and that the average contact pressure is much less than the pressure exposure guidelines. So I thought it'd be interesting as we think about how our workstations have evolved over time, how we've used computers differently over time, to just look back in history a little bit and see what computer workstations might have looked like in the past. So this is a computer. This is arguably the first programmable electronic computer. It was built in the United Kingdom in the 1940s during World War II. You can see the naval personnel there operating this computer, and the input was through the paper tapes that you see strung on all of these pulleys. These are the paper tapes. That was the input, along with various settings on all of these knobs and dials that that controlled this first electronic programmable computer. So this is maybe a second generation computer. This was ENIAC, built in the U.S. And used between 1946 and 1955. So you can see some interesting things here. We see a lot of people standing and walking and squatting to plug in connections. We see people sitting at desks to, again, manipulate a fairly complex display there. So something much different than what we're accustomed to seeing today. So I thought it'd be a good idea to try to think about where we might be going in the future. So here are some conclusions, but I want to preface this by mentioning an article that appeared in the late 80s in I think it was in one of the big business journals, and it talked about laptop computers as mobile devices. And basically it said, you know, it's a great idea, but it's never going to go anywhere. So we've seen how that was completely different than predicted. So here's my projection for what's going to happen in the future. Computers and the manner in which we use them will continue to evolve. The human factors and ergonomics techniques that we use to optimize the system performance for these new ways of working must also evolve. And by that I mean that when we look at things like user safety, user comfort, and user productivity, we're going to need to evolve new techniques and new ways of looking at these new technologies. So the third point is that our understanding of the human-computer interface cannot remain static. We can't go on thinking that because we know how to fix or how to set up fixed desktop workstations that we know how to deal with computer ergonomics across the board, because as we've seen, there's a tremendous mobile component that's developing. So that's my remarks. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Tom, thank you so much. That was so interesting. You know, as you were sharing these evidence-based articles from the Work Journal, it made me think about how, even from when this was published, how we are seeing almost an epidemic explosion of people wanting sit-stand desks in the workplace. I see it, you know, all over the university. You know, and you gave some advice here, but what would you share with an employer who's now getting quite a bit of demands from his or her employees that they must have sit-stand to be productive, to stay healthy? You know, how would you address that on a, you know, a fairly large scale, where I'm calling it the epidemic now?
I think that the first thing, I'm going to give you a different answer than, or at least phrase it differently than I would if it was someone looking at purchasing a large number of sit-stand desks. So there have always been strong biomechanical arguments for using sit-stand desks, or at least using sit-stand desks and alternating between sitting and standing. So that's one argument for it. There does seem to be some suggestion that there is a metabolic effect going on. I don't think that's very well understood, but it does seem to be there. So Michelle Robertson's paper of a few years ago, for example, would perhaps address some of the productivity issues. Her work looked at people processing insurance claim forms and found that people who were alternating between sitting and standing were more accurate, and they had less rework, so consequently were more productive. And then I think a final argument for them is that a good sit-stand workstation will support, you know, a small woman sitting, so it will go down very low, or a tall man standing. So you're going to get a lot of adjustable work surface benefits from that. So I think those are the main issues that are pro and con for sit-stand workstation. There's always a balance between costs, but on whole, my tendency is to recommend them where that's economically feasible.
Great, and I feel the same way too. Tom, we've got two questions. Thank you for that response. Susan wrote, what would you recommend as a sit-stand ratio? And I think you addressed that there's no confirming evidence yet. But if someone said to you informally, even though the evidence is evolving, what would you say would be a good, sit-stand ratio?
Well, just as you said, there is no conclusive evidence to say that 15 minutes a day or 4 hours per day. There's no objective evidence to support either one of those claims. So there's lots of opinions. So I think that Zoet and Michelle recommended standing for at least an hour a day, but spreading that out over the course of an 8-hour day in order to minimize the risk of physical discomfort from standing. And I guess maybe this is a good point to point out that there are detrimental effects of standing for prolonged periods as well. So I think there are some other recommendations. I think there was a group out of the UK that was saying stand at least 2 hours per day and work your way up to 4. But all of those are based on opinion rather than on any actual evidence. I do know that there are several studies ongoing now that are trying to sort that out and give a better answer. So that would be something to maybe check back on in a year to see if there are more objective specifications for a sit-stand ratio.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I think, that's going to be important to have some guidelines instead of, just sort of suggestions at this point. So we have another question. We're going to change the topic quite a bit. Can you speak to the benefits of gliding over arm rests versus resting on them when keying and mousing? We have great results teaching people to use a piano playing type of movement instead of resting on armrests or the desk.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that when people rest on surfaces, that their arm and, well, assuming that it's a correctly adjusted surface, that their upper extremity postures are better than if they're unsupported. So, I mean, a good way to think of this is to hold your arms out unsupported and see how long it is before that becomes uncomfortable. So, to my knowledge, the argument against support has always been contact pressure, and as we saw in Jay Kim's study, the contact pressure is low and intermittent, and it doesn't appear that it's at a level where we should be concerned about it.
Thanks, Tom. Now, Denise Finch, and hi Denise, wrote the following. I believe that we would need a height range of 23 to 48 inches to accommodate elbow height range of the 5th percentile female to the 95th percentile of men. Do you suggest that the adjustable tables meet that range? Also, what are your thoughts about electric adjustable versus pneumatic style sit-stand?
So that height range sounds about right. I wouldn't swear that it's the exact range, but it sounds about right. Would I suggest that adjustable tables meet that range? Well, certainly if they're going to be stand tables, they should. I think if you look at the ANSI 100 document, there are some suggestions there in terms of making trade-offs between tilt of the input surface, like the keyboard and that sort of thing, that might let you play with that height range a little bit. But by and large, that seems to be about right for a sit-stand work surface adjustment range. And then finally, electric versus crank versus pneumatic style. Personally, to me, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of difference between the electric and the pneumatic style. But my sense is that from talking with people in the field, that the electric ones are more popular, and the crank height ones, it seems like they rarely ever get used, that people don't change them.
Yeah, Tom, I've found the same thing, and thanks for posting that question. What do you think about the sit stand that actually retrofits on top of someone's desktop?
Well, I think it's a good thing in that it facilitates sit-stand work, but, some of the drawbacks are those that we saw with keyboard trays years ago, is that, you run out of places to put the paper that you're working with. So that might be one concern. But the benefit is that it gives you additional height adjustments so that you can work seated and standing. You certainly want to, I'm not sure, I think some of those may only do the keyboard, the input support surfaces adjust, and you'd certainly want to be able to adjust them, the display with them.
Yeah, that's the same thing that I have found as well. And I also find that people are less likely to make the changes of sit and standing if it takes a lot more effort to do.
Absolutely.
Let's look in the future. Let's have fun with this. Let's look in the future. I'm now starting to see people talking to their wristwatches. Are we going to see computers now on our wrists? We're seeing the smartphone on our wrist. Are we going to see more computers on our wrists, perhaps? Or what do you see in the future? Are we going to get smaller, even smaller than we have now?
So I think that there are several things happening. Certainly head-mounted displays are coming along, and those are going to have a whole crop of issues all their own. It's the first time that we will have had displays, an inch or two from an individual's eye. It's not clear what effect that will have on people's vision. It does seem like there's kind of a split in how people use computers. So desktops tend to be used for things like composing, doing pretty much heads down work. One reason for that is that there's for virtual keyboards like you might have on a smartphone, or for spoken input, you can enter less data per unit time with virtual keyboards than you can with a full-size mechanical keyboard. That may limit some of the things that are done with portable wearable devices, is that speaking or using a virtual keyboard may limit your ability to do, may limit your throughput. But other than that, are there going to be wearable computers? Absolutely. A lot of things I think are coming along that will extend, the idea of a smart watch to smart garments to who knows what.
It's exciting, I have to say, as all of this is evolving. And we have a couple of comments, and then I'd love you to take a moment to maybe talk about the OERC and let people know about that.
Sure.
So Susan wrote, I researched sits to stand this year and concluded that the best option is to move every 20 minutes and walk. That's great, Susan. Did you conduct your own research, or did you find that from the evidence literature? Perhaps type that in and let us know. And then let's see what else here. Denise wrote, I found that the desktop sit stand tend to place the keyboard higher in the sitting seated ergonomics position and are not well addressed unless there is also a good keyboard tray. And I feel the same way, Denise. It can be an issue. I think why we're seeing people purchasing it because it's a lot less expensive. So Susan wrote from the evidence. Okay, from the evidence literature. Thank you. Thanks, Susan. So Tom, let me turn it over to you for a couple of minutes to just let people know about the OERC.
The OERC is the short name for the Office Ergonomics Research Committee. It's a group currently of 16 companies, and it's a research consortium. So these 16 companies pool, they each pay membership dues each year, and we pool those dues and fund research studies. I think we've funded it. Karen's done a couple of studies for us, I think.
Yeah, two. You've funded two of them for me, and I'm very grateful.
So the interesting thing is that this group is a mix of people from ergonomists and human factors specialists, from computer manufacturers like Apple, HP, Dell, Microsoft, those sorts of folks, from furniture manufacturers, so Steelcase, Knoll, Herman Miller, Workrite Ergonomics, all of those sorts of folks, Technion, and also people who are running ergonomics and wellness programs within large companies. So we get a lot of good cross-fertilization, cross-discipline, if you want to call it that, discussion. The device manufacturers can tell us what's coming down the road, and everybody else can figure out how they might be impacted by that and how they're going to deal with it. It's an opportunity for end users to come back to the furniture or computer manufacturers and say, it would be great if such and such did this, that sort of thing. So it's a research consortium. We also use some of our dues money to fund ongoing education for our members. So we have 3 meetings per year, and typically we have a topic of interest. So whether that's sit-stand sedentary work or lighting or that sort of thing, where we bring in experts to talk with us about that particular topic. Then once every 18 months we have a research conference. We typically bring in about a dozen researchers from around the world speaking on topics identified by the OERC members, and it's an opportunity for the OERC members and the researchers, again, to have these kinds of conversations to say what's important to them, what's going on in their world. Let's see. I think that's it. Any questions about OERC?
Thanks, Tom. The OERC makes such an important contribution to advancing the evidence and knowledge for people, and we're so grateful. Thank you so much. Let me see. I don't know if there's any other questions. Do we have any other questions that people can post? I don't see any. Tom, could you advance the slide, please? So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Tom, thank you so much. I always learn something more. Even if I've read the article previously, there's always something else that you can take away and really apply to everyday practice, ourselves and with the people that we serve. The Learn at Work webinar series, hosted from the journal Work, and I will be moderating them, is going to expand in 2017. We will have a Learn at Work webinar every month. We'll be using the GoToWebinar platform, which will allow you to register in advance. There's absolutely no cost, but it will also send you out a reminder if you forget the URL or the date. We'll have reminders sent out. Our next one will be January 26, 2017. Our webinars are always 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dr. Valerie Rice will discuss personal resilience and coping among U.S. military and veterans and the implications for work. You will find that all of the Learn at Work webinars are provided by authors of whose articles are published in our journal Work. The topics will vary. We will have, in fact, if you go to the Work Journal Facebook site, You'll see the posting for all of the webinars that have been scheduled already. All of our Learn at Work webinars are recorded, and we have our own Learn at Work YouTube channel. So please, go to the channel, subscribe, and you'll have the opportunity to listen to Tom's presentation again. It was just full of such important information. And you can also listen to some of the previously recorded webinars. So I want to thank you so much, and Tom, thank you again. Denise Finch thanks you, and all the people who are here. And please spread the word because there's more to follow regarding this. Oh, Tom, one last question. I just saw that. Is there research on the risks of lifting, lowering the desk, sit, stand, while reaching and bending like they are required?
I don't know of any research that specifically looked at that issue. All of the ones that I'm aware of require pretty minimal force to move them. So I think most of any strain to the person using them would be from the posture and the load created by body segments, at least biomechanically.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, Tom, thank you so much, and everyone, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you on January 26th.
And thank you, Karen, for the special issue. I think that was a very cool thing.
Thank you, Tom. I'm glad that you liked that, and thank you for being such an active board member for work. And since you thought it was a cool thing, maybe we'll have to do it again in the future.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.